Faced with charges of running a Washington, D.C. prostitution ring, Deborah Jeane Palfrey is giving phone records, a list of numbers, to a news organization to smoke out the names of former clients.
Most of the men on this list just aren't newsworthy.
The mainstream media pays no attention to this.
But you want to put it on record that you're not planning to commit suicide?
No, I'm not planning to commit suicide.
Deborah Palfrey, the so-called D.C. madam, has apparently committed suicide.
Police say several notes were found that described her intention to take her life.
Deborah Jeane Palfrey was born on March 18, 1956, to Frank and Blanche Palfrey in Charleroi, Pennsylvania. Her classmate at Charleroi Area High School described her as shy and serious.
She was a majorette, and she was quiet. She, kind of on the shy side, but very caring. I enjoyed her as my friend. She was very considerate of other people and considerate of how their feelings were. In school, there were people that tended to pick on her, but they were ones that picked on everybody. She just was more sensitive to it, I think.
Palfrey went on to obtain a degree in criminal justice from Rollins College in Florida in 1978. She then briefly attended the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego, California, but did not finish her law degree. Deborah Palfrey began working as a paralegal in San Diego. In the late 1980s, she briefly dated a man named Thomas Check, telling him she worked as an interior designer. The relationship did not end on good terms, and Thomas Check filed a restraining order against Palfrey in 1989. In 1990, Palfrey started her own escort service. She sought to create a more professional alternative to other escort services, which she believed were seedy, lazy, and incompetent. In December of 1990, Deborah Palfrey was arrested on charges of pimping, pandering, and extortion. She failed to show up for her scheduled trial in August 1991 and was caught trying to flee to Canada on October 14th. Palfrey would eventually plead guilty on one count, and in June 1992, she was sentenced to 18 months in prison. In her sentencing memorandum, she promised the judge that she would never operate another escort service.
Jeane was originally arrested for running an escort service in California. She was working as a cocktail waitress. It escalated into her being a prostitute and then managing other prostitutes.
She hated the experience of being in jail.
She told me she had been raped repeatedly. So that was a very brutal experience for her.
She said it was horrifying. She came out physically and mentally damaged.
Immediately upon release from prison in late 1993, Deborah Palfrey founded Pamela Martin and Associates. This new escort service was designed to cater to wealthy, high-end clients in the Washington, D.C. area.
I promoted it in the Yellow Pages because, when I started back in 1993, we didn't have the internet. We barely had cell phones back then.
Jeane was actually running her operation from her house. She ran it from the laundry room where she would answer the phone and book the clients and the customers.
My God, I was on those phones every night for 13 years.
Jeane Palfrey would talk with the man on the phone, and she would find out what he was interested in. Then she would call an escort.
The girls charged $300 for 90 minutes, but they had to send half of their quote-unquote salary via mail order weekly to Jeane in California.
Jeane Palfrey often described the women that she hired as the Ann Taylor look.
She did this because it was very important that they not stand out in a hotel lobby.
There are three types of services out there in the adult escort world. One is social service. The second is fantasy, which is this in-between place where I resided, which was truly, absolutely 100% sexual, but it was not illegal sex. The third is prostitution.
Jeane Palfrey was always very emphatic that the women who were working for her were not allowed to break any laws.
She originally had a little contract her employees signed, and one of the terms that they had to initial was individuals caught performing illegal activities of any nature will be terminated.
The only two things that are considered basically illegal are prostitution, intercourse of any kind, and oral sex. Otherwise, everything is absolutely legal for all intents and purposes.
Pamela Martin and Associates operated for nearly 13 years without any charges of illegal activity. By the fall of 2006, the 50-year-old Deborah Palfrey was ready to call it quits on the escort business and was preparing to live out her retirement years in Germany.
In October of 2006, she was in Berlin exploring housing options.
She wanted to buy an apartment there. She had found one she liked. And she really wanted to begin a new life there, far away from America.
I opened my Charles Schwab account to do a little day trading, and I couldn't gain access. And I explained to the customer service rep my dilemma, and he put me on hold for about 5 or 10 minutes and came back 10 minutes later and informed me that, "Ma'am, your property has been seized by the United States Department of Treasury. I advise you to get an attorney."
They used a legal tool called civil asset forfeiture.
Civil forfeiture is whenever you have a criminal enterprise, the government can go after the money that you've gotten as a result of that enterprise, seize it, convict you, and then take it.
After I talked to the Charles Schwab agent, I found out that the feds simultaneously, while I was making the call to Schwab, were back in California at 8 a.m. in the morning raiding my house.
The federal investigation of Deborah Palfrey was unprecedented because prostitution is not a federal crime, and the federal prosecutors were not pursuing any other escort services or their clients.
Jeane was using the U.S. mails to transfer money the government believed they could prove came from criminal behavior. So, for example, if Jeane had only operated in Maryland and never had an escort leave the state and never sent money out of the state, the federal government would not have had the ability to charge her with anything.
Nobody else in Washington, D.C. has been targeted. None of the other agencies, none of the other independents. It was only me.
This whole case started with a civil case against Jeane Palfrey.
I was told unless I pled, they were going to charge me with RICO. Nobody in this country who has run a quote-unquote benign escort service has ever been charged with racketeering. I mean, racketeering is Tony Soprano territory. I told him at that point, let's go. Let's go. You're not getting 1 penny of my life savings and not 1 minute of my liberty.
In March 2007, Palfrey was indicted on charges of racketeering, using the mail for illegal purposes, and money laundering. She pleaded not guilty and vowed to fight the charges in court.
I employed independent contractors ages 23 to 25 years of age and up to age 55, with 2 to 4 years of college education. Many had graduate school educations, who either worked and or attended school during regular business hours. Correspondingly, both the independent contractors and the clientele were upscale and came from the more refined walks of life here in the nation's capital. Each subcontractor signed a legally binding contract at the onset of employment, stating she would not, among other things, engage in illegal behavior while employed at Pamela Martin & Associates. In addition, no promises or claims, directly or indirectly, was ever made to a client that he should expect the associate to perform illegal acts for hire.
Jeane thought that if she could put some of her clients on the stand, they would endorse what she was saying, which was that this was not a prostitution racket.
She knew she had a secret weapon.
The phone numbers of all of the customers that had ever used the service.
Jeane Palfrey had all of these numbers of high-powered people in D.C. Now, though, she had to connect names with those numbers.
The decision ultimately was made to hand over the records to a responsible media outlet, in this case, ABC News in New York. I do expect their reporting to help identify potential witnesses for my defense.
While ABC were plowing through Jeane's phone records, 2 high-level names in government actually got leaked.
Randall Tobias with the State Department and Harlan Ullman, who was a well-known defense strategist.
Randall Tobias admitted he had used Pamela Martin, but he completely denied ever having illegal sex, but promptly resigned from his position.
Friday's admission by Mr. Tobias that he engaged in legal activity while a customer of my firm supports my position all along that I operated a sexual, albeit legal, business for 13 years from 1993 to 2006.
ABC's 2020 is going to air a special television event tomorrow night in which 7 names on the infamous D.C. Madams list is going to be revealed.
These were not chic women. These are very nice women who just needed to make a few extra dollars.
One was a professor at the University of Maryland. Palfrey says federal agents had no interest in the records and studiously avoided learning about her male customers. As usually happens in such cases, records trace back to thousands of men, including a career Justice Department prosecutor. There are NASA officials, at least 5 military officers, including the commander of an Air Force intelligence squadron, and prominent CEOs, officials at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and lobbyists, both Republican and Democratic.
There were no members of Congress that we could find in these phone records, no White House officials. Quite frankly, but for the few exceptions, most of the men on this list just aren't newsworthy.
All they listed was the type or professions of the individuals using the service. They didn't list any specific names.
I know for a fact they received pressure from Disney executives who in turn received pressure from the White House not to run those names. I've reported that Dick Cheney was one of those clients. I stand by that report. I will continue to stand by that report, and I have other names that are very close to Cheney.
Was Deborah Jeane Palfrey your source that it was Dick Cheney?
Somebody very close to Jeane Palfrey was my source.
Jeane and I were livid and realized that we could not count on ABC News.
So then they decide they're going to reach out to an investigative journalist, and they get in touch with someone named Dan Moldea.
I sat down at my desk and at my computer, and I ran reverse searches on each phone number. And I went through hundreds of numbers. I had to stop someplace because it was such a time-consuming process. And so I decided arbitrarily just to stop on February 27th, 2001. On that day, in the phone records, I saw a telephone number I had not seen before. I ran into the database. It came up David Vitter, a Republican senator from Louisiana.
Happening now, a senator and his wife come from the shadows of the D.C. Madam scandal.
I want to again offer my deep, sincere apologies to all those I have let down and disappointed with these actions from my past.
This is not a case about prostitution. It never was, it isn't now, and it never will be. There's something very rotten at the core of all this. Why hasn't this case really come to light? And it still hasn't come to light, even as we speak. The mainstream media pays no attention to this. My attorney, Mr. Sibley, my civil attorney, Mr. Sibley, and I have persisted for months and months and months trying to get this story out. Nobody wants to listen to us in the mainstream media. You know, I really have an excellent case on so many levels and in so many ways, and I have numerous motions before the court right now, any one of which could kill this case quickly. The court has appointed a first-rate attorney to me, Preston Burton, a criminal attorney. He represented Monica Lewinsky during the Bill Clinton impeachment. He also represented Aldrich James back in the 90s. And not to be concerned, I have no intention of letting anyone buy me off or make any kind of a deal with me.
And you're not planning to commit suicide?
And I'm not planning to commit suicide either.
In October 2007, Deborah Palfrey replaced her criminal defense attorney, Preston Burton, with Montgomery Blair Sibley, who was also representing her in the civil asset forfeiture case. Sibley immediately requested several subpoenas for phone records from various telephone companies and government agencies, including the FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, IRS, State Department, and the White House. On November 13, 2007, Judge Gladys Kessler approved the subpoenas requested by Sibley. A month later, Judge Kessler was inexplicably replaced by Judge James Robertson. Judge Robertson held a status hearing on December 14th, in which he quashed all the subpoenas issued to government agencies. This act prevented the identification of 87% of Palfrey's clients. Judge Robertson also sealed the names of the remaining 815 individuals who had already been identified by the defense. In January 2008, Robertson terminated Sibley as Palfrey's attorney, reinstating Preston Burton as his replacement.
How do we know that Brandi Britton, one of your girls who committed suicide, didn't commit suicide?
Well, we don't know about that. There's two schools of thoughts. One says yes, one says no.
Brandi Britton was an escort who worked for Jeane for a period of time, branched out and started her own escort service in the Baltimore area.
Police arrested 42-year-old Brandi Britton after she allegedly offered an undercover police officer sex for $400.
What were the circumstances that made people question Brandi Britton's death?
Well, people say that she was a very upbeat person, a very positive person, that she was going into court, she was ready to fight him, that she absolutely was not going to give in, and all of a sudden, I think a few days before she was to go to trial, she committed suicide. And her family members, her friends say that this was extremely abnormal. She was not in the frame of mind to commit suicide, that perhaps she knew something. There's been a lot of speculation about that. She had very little to lose. She wasn't going to go to jail. She was simply being charged on a prostitution case.
She'd been busted, but I guess she was going to name names or something.
Who knows? Who knows? Maybe that's what they thought she was going to do. Maybe that's what they thought I was going to do when I suddenly closed my business in August of 2006 and was selling my house and trying to move to Europe. I had no intention of doing any such thing. I just had every intention of just moving on with my life.
The fact that you're so visible really protects you going on Larry King and other big shows, but you want to put it on record that you're not planning to commit suicide?
No, I'm not planning to commit suicide. I'm planning to go into court on April 7th if indeed we do have the trial, and I plan on defending myself vigorously, and I plan on exposing the government in ways that, I do not think they want me to expose them. I want them to explain to me in open court why they came after me.
The whole Jeane Palfrey story was one of a woman who supposedly had rich and powerful customers in Washington.
So understandably, it came as a big surprise when Jeane Palfrey's attorney didn't call a single former client, not one, to testify that they hadn't had sex with Palfrey's escorts.
The defense strategy was Jeane was willfully blind to what was going on between the customers and her escorts.
The prosecutor's biggest weapon was that they had all these women who had worked for Jeane Palfrey who were prepared to testify against her. One was asked how often she ended up having sex with the client, and she said 90% of the time. One of them even went so far as to saying, I asked Jeane, who provides the condoms? Will the client have the condoms? And she said, no, you need to bring them. These were fairly damning things for Jeane.
Jeane Palfrey was found guilty of all the criminal charges against her.
Deborah Jeane Palfrey was convicted on all counts today connected to that escort service, which catered to the rich and powerful.
Guilty of racketeering, mail fraud, and money laundering.
I had been brought back in to work on the appeal, and we had some very strong appellate issues. I was very confident that that conviction would be overturned.
Even though Jeane Palfrey faced about 55 years, the conventional wisdom was that she would only serve about 6 years.
Police in Florida say a woman who apparently committed suicide near Tampa today is Deborah Jeane Palfrey.
Deborah Palfrey, the so-called D.C. madam, has apparently committed suicide. She was found in a shed near her mother's home in Florida.
Police say Palfrey hung herself with a nylon rope in a shed attached to her mother's house around 10:45 Thursday morning. Blanche Palfrey discovered the body.
Police say several notes were found that described her intention to take her life.
The Tarpon Springs Police Department investigated Palfrey's suicide along with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office and the FBI. Police say she did leave suicide notes, and they don't suspect foul play.
We feel for the victims that are left behind in any instance like this.
Upon reports of her death, there was immediate suspicion that Deborah Palfrey may have been murdered.
Jeane was really a feisty, tough, empowered woman who didn't at all seem to me like the kind of person who would take her own life.
When I heard that she had killed herself and that they said it was suicide, I did not believe it. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. The Debbie that I knew in high school would not have done that to her elderly mother.
It floored me. It made no sense whatsoever. I talked to her 2 or 3 days before, and we thought we were on track to take a good appeal, get her bailed out during the appeal, and continue to fight this thing going forward. I'm conflicted as to whether Jeane's death was a suicide or a very highly organized murder.
Was it really suicide? The internet is going bonkers with this one.
Her friend said that that's not her signature on the suicide note. She would have been able to make all this money. She would have been famous. There would have been book deals, movies. Why would she possibly do this?
Could these two notes been written under duress? I mean, if someone told me they're going to murder my mother and my sister if I don't sit down and write a heartfelt suicide letter, wouldn't I write it?
She said, listen, I'll never kill myself. If they claim that, I was murdered. So we have a tape of her saying she wouldn't commit suicide. Then you look at Brandi Britton. She was facing 6 months in jail. She was a professor. You know, she had a psychology degree. She was saying, this is hypocritical. I'm going to tell who my Johns were. And then she hangs herself. Number one, Geraldo, you covered a lot of criminology. You know, women don't normally hang themselves. First, one of her girls kills herself. Now she kills herself.
They take pills.
Exactly.
She was a woman who had a very strong core. She was a fighter from the get-go. There was no government program to take down prostitutes. There was a program she believed to take her down. Think about it. You've got a top State Department official. You've got a military strategist, a United States senator. You've got all of these individuals, lobbyists, paying for prostitutes. At the same time, you've got the head of the Maryland State Police who's being indicted and convicted for using the executive protection unit to move the prostitutes around. You've got a federal prosecutor at that time who was murdered and who yet his case is unsolved. And indeed, I have the book, The Midnight Ride of Jonathan Luna, for anyone interested. Everything raises a doubt.
When I heard that this was an apparent suicide, I couldn't believe it. I was doubtful from the get-go. If I was a prosecutor on this case, I would make sure and investigate it very thoroughly. I think it's far too coincidental that the two women involved in this would both hang themselves. Right?
Meanwhile, Dan Moldea told the media that Palfrey had confided in him that she was contemplating suicide.
She told me on no fewer than 3 occasions that in lieu of going back to prison where she had spent 18 months back in the early 90s, she would commit suicide.
It should be noted that Dan Moldea previously authored a book concluding the death of Vince Foster to be a suicide. Moldea's account also conflicts with that of Palfrey's friend and colleague, Joe Stryzak.
Deborah Jeane Palfrey has many ties to Central Florida. For the past 12 years, she's owned a condo at Park Lake Towers. The building manager, who asked us not to show his face, talked with Palfrey Monday before she left for her mother's in Tarpon Springs. Now, he claims that she did not at all seem suicidal. Palfrey often told him she believed she was being followed.
She insinuated there was a contract out for her. So I fully believe they succeeded.
So that's part of the NBC newscast on this there in Florida, and I really appreciate Joseph Stryzak. Mr. Stryzak, I appreciate your courage in going public and putting out your name. But I was just going to ask about the specifics of thinking a contract was out on her.
Well, she told me she feared for her life. And that's how we proceeded to talk about her being followed, about the safety of the building here, so she didn't have to worry about that. And she didn't say contract out for her life. She just told me she feared for her life. So,
and that she thought that she was being followed.
Oh, yes, she said definitely.
When was the last time you saw her? What did she say?
That was a week ago, Monday. And she told me at that time she feared for her life and that she was happy to spend the night at Park Lake Towers because she wasn't being watched.
Stryzak also stated unequivocally that the signature on one of Palfrey's alleged suicide notes was not written by Palfrey. However, Palfrey's mother and sister believed the notes were written by Deborah Palfrey. Tarpon Springs police officially ruled Palfrey's death a suicide within days. The incident report states that they spoke extensively to Dan Moldea about his claims of Palfrey's suicidal intentions. The detective also stated that he tried to contact Alex Jones to discuss Palfrey's statements on his radio show. After several attempts via phone and email, the detective said he was unable to reach Jones for an interview. Some researchers believe that Palfrey could have been a CIA asset and that Pamela Martin and Associates was being used for political blackmail.
Last year, she and her defense team tried to invoke the Classified Information Procedures Act in the U.S. District Court in Washington. That's only invoked when you're preparing to reveal either classified information or the names of people who are intelligence officers.
Deborah Palfrey herself speculated before her death that she may have been targeted because someone could have been using her service to blackmail high-level officials. She claimed to have no specific knowledge of any such blackmail schemes.
They may have been tracking what was going on with your business to use that without your knowledge for higher-ups to actually blackmail people.
That's kind of my thinking, or something as nefarious as that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's exactly what we believe has occurred. I think there is something serious at the core of all of this. What that is, I don't know at this point in time, but something happened and something was going on behind my back with this agency. And when I made all these aberrant moves, selling my house, closing the business, wiring the money, that's when they panicked a little and came out here to find out what was going on.
One of the things she said, I distinctly remember her stating this, that she had information that could have a bearing on the 9/11 attack, that some of her employees may have picked up information beforehand that would have been very, very useful to the investigation.
Hold your horses. This is an exclusive.
I said, Jeane, it makes sense that your escorts may have been used, especially with all the activity around McLean, by the CIA. And she said, well, she wouldn't commit to that. But then she did say something interesting. She said, I know I have information that would have been of great interest to the 9/11 Commission. I said, you mean to tell me that some of your employees, and I have to think that they spoke an awful lot. And she said, yes, there's information that they have that would have been very important for the 9/11 Commission to know, having to do with intelligence they picked up about 9/11 before it happened.
Palfrey also had a connection to former GOP congressman and CIA director Porter Goss, who famously had breakfast with one of the 9/11 conspirators on the morning of the attacks. Porter Goss resigned in the wake of rumors he was connected to a prostitution ring a few months before Palfrey's arrest.
Shirlington Limousine was ferrying around her escorts to poker parties where Porter Goss, the head of the CIA, was in attendance.
That's admitted. He had to step down. That was a Watergate Hotel.
Is there a bombshell that could change the outcome of the presidential election? That's what the former lawyer for the notorious D.C. Madam is claiming. He just posted this video on a GoFundMe page, trying to raise money for legal fees to release the D.C. Madam's records.
Since 2007, I have been under a court order restraining me from publicly releasing those records. Those records contain information relevant to the 2016 presidential election.
Time is of the essence, he tells the U.S. Supreme Court, given the significance of the upcoming political primaries and caucuses.
I believe this information is relevant to that political discourse.
When you have someone with something that could implicate a presidential candidate or someone that is very close to that presidential candidate doing criminal activity, especially something like prostitution or some type of escort type of service that was illegal, that is major and the public has a right to know.
Let me be clear, this National Enquirer story is garbage. It is complete and utter lies. It is a tabloid smear. And it is a smear that has come from Donald Trump and his henchmen.
After Sibley's motion was denied, he had no legal means of releasing the names of Palfrey's clients. Instead, he publicly released the names of the organizations where the individuals identified in the phone records were employed. These included the FBI, Hewlett-Packard, the IRS, Lockheed Martin, Oracle, and several other agencies of the U.S. government. The unusual prosecution and death of Deborah Palfrey offered a glimpse into the underworld of American politics. Some of the peculiar aspects of Palfrey's story caused journalists and researchers to ask several important questions. Why did Deborah Palfrey start another escort service immediately upon release from prison in 1993? She promised the judge she would never do it again, and she was violently abused while in prison. Could someone else have influenced her to start a new service in Washington, D.C., promising her protection? Why was Palfrey singled out for prosecution while her clients, employees, and dozens of other escort services were never charged? Why did ABC News refuse to name names of individuals identified in Palfrey's phone records? Why did Judge Robertson quash all of the subpoenas to government agencies for information that could help Palfrey's defense? Why did Preston Burton refuse to call any of Palfrey's clients as witnesses? Why did the Tarpon Springs police and the media give more weight to a second-hand account from Dan Moldea than they did to Palfrey's own words on tape saying she would not commit suicide? Why didn't the police take seriously Palfrey's reports to Stryzak that she was being followed? What did Palfrey know that would interest the 9/11 Commission? And why wouldn't she be able to publicly discuss it in media interviews? Why did she request to discuss matters related to classified information with the court?
You could drive down the streets of Washington and look at every building on your left and your right, and in each and every one of those buildings, we had clients.
Was the death of Deborah Palfrey indeed a suicide? The last resort of a broken woman who would do anything to avoid going to prison? Or was she murdered after being forced to write suicide notes? Was Palfrey killed to make sure no one knew the full story of Pamela Martin and Associates? What do you think? Follow the links in the description to learn more and decide for yourself. Please leave your thoughts in the comments.